Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with Mai. Mai, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, Rob. My name is Trow, Trow. My Christian name is Welsh and unpronounceable. It's Myrion. So my friends call me Mai. So I write as MJ Trow, but my Trow is probably the best way to go forward. You can call me what you like.
We're here to discuss the Kennedy assassination because obviously it's probably foreign for a lot of people, for a younger person like myself, to be interested into the case. But there has been a lot of literature and works dealing with the Kennedy assassination. Some that get really conspiracy, some that kind of stick to just problems in the investigation, and then some that or a lot that get publicized or more viewership, I should say, by mass media has been along the official narrative until relatively recently. We still deal with some of those problems, but can you take me into your beginnings of learning about the JFK assassination? What struck you like how old were if you were alive at the time, and what caused your hesitation into the official narrative?
Okay, well, I was 14 when it happened. It was a Friday, and of course, there's a big time difference between Dallas and the UK. So to us, it was evening, and I was waiting to watch Bonanza, which was my favorite Western on the television, and it wasn't on. Now, we only had two channels in those days in the UK, and so there wasn't much choice. I turned over to the other side. Nothing on that channel either. There was a complete news blackout in the UK, and obviously we were all agog. What's happening? What's going on? And it was only slowly, obviously, that the information came through that the president had been killed, and it was many, many, many years later that we all saw the Zapruder film for the first time. So the information just seeped out slowly. And many years later, I became a crime writer. I was an historian and a teacher for years. I went into crime writing, and the Kennedy killing is the big one, really. It's one of these big unanswerables. You know, it rocked an entire generation, not just in the States, but around the world. And it still hasn't been answered now. And one of the things I find quite bizarre is that a man is killed in public, in full view of thousands and ultimately millions of people via the television, via Zapruder, and we still have no real answers. It really is quite extraordinary.
What about the investigation, I guess, really caught your attention at first when you really started researching and being like, there's a little bit more here than just a lone assassin? Besides the Zapruder phone, which I think everyone sees, the head goes back and to the left. Where did you decide to tackle? Like, let me investigate, let me see what's going on here, and where does it not match up?
I think it was because the whole pointing fingers at Oswald was too simple. It was too easy. We of course just get all our information via the media, don't we? You know, via newspapers, back in the day, via television, online now, muddied even more today by social media, which distorts things still further. But it struck me that the more I learned about Oswald, the less likely he became as a shooter. Yeah, he was a Marine, but in the Marines, the word marksman means average shot. It doesn't mean a crack shot. I didn't see how a man like that, with a very inferior rifle, which cost him a few dollars. He bought it. He bought it mail order. I really couldn't see how he could possibly have inflicted those wounds. The famous 6 seconds in Dealey Plaza, three shots in that time by an average shooter with a substandard gun made no sense. There had to be more to it. It had to be more complicated.
I'm sure you know, but Oswald's a complex guy. Some people have different definitions of who he is or what he has done, or hell, I don't even know if he went to Mexico City or not. That's still clouded, which is like if you're really trying to analyze the case from historical terms, I don't think there's ever been so many maybe he did, maybe he didn't in a historical thing. But I have to ask what your version of Oswald is. Where did you go for the resources to learn more about Oswald?
I wish you hadn't asked me that because I know even less about Oswald than when I started all this. He's all things to all men, isn't he? I mean, he's CIA, he's an FBI informant, he's a communist, he's a traitor. There are so many aspects to the man. People see him from so many angles. He himself, of course, famously said he was a patsy, that he was set up. By whom is the big question. But I think that is right. I think he was, in the UK, we call him a stooge, but it means the same thing. He was somebody who was put in the frame because it was convenient. It's so much easier to blame the lone nut than it is to blame any kind of organization or institution who might be behind a shooting like that. And again, it was just too straightforward. It's almost as if he's standing there with a gun in his hand saying, "Look at me, I did it." And that just won't wash. You have to go further. You have to get behind the scenes, and you have to try and find out what's really going on. And in the case of JFK, that is appallingly difficult. I've written a lot of true crime books in my time, but this one is, I think, the most complicated case I've ever come across.
Now, your book, The JFK Assassination, Conspiracies and Coverups, do you think there's evidence of the conspiracy? Because I stand to believe that there's more evidence to show people, like average viewers or just people new to the case, that there's more evidence of the cover up. Because there's so much that wasn't followed through where, and you can just ask a child or ask anyone that would be, hey, if you were doing an investigation, would you eliminate the possibility of a getaway driver within 48 hours? No, I wouldn't. I would make sure I checked every angle. Well, they did that within 48 hours.
Yeah, absolutely so. What I try to do in my book is not to worry too much about who's behind the whole thing, about the motivation for killing Kennedy. And he had a lot of enemies, and you can point the finger at a number of different groups or individuals. But it's the cock-ups, it's the mistakes, and the cover-ups about those mistakes, I think, that really concern me. Everybody, and it's human nature, is watching their back. The Dallas Police Department is, the Secret Service is, the CIA is, the FBI is, the Warren Commission. Everybody is looking out for themselves. How can we wriggle out of this? How can we distance ourselves from the shooting? How can we claim that we are completely innocent of the whole thing, that we're not somehow involved? And it is human nature. I guess we all do it in a variety of ways all our lives. But when it comes to something as important as the murder of a president, then I think it's time to start telling the truth.
Can I ask, out of those examples that you listed, when it comes to the Warren Commission, the Dallas Police Department, FBI, or CIA, where did you primarily feel that you were drawn to the most when it came to kind of exposing the cover up of actions?
From the point of view of the cover up, I'm drawn to the CIA. Simply because they have such extraordinarily wide powers. They have the people, they have the resources, they have the money, the technology, everything to be able to effectively make things go away. I think the police department made mistakes. It's indefensible that there was no written statement, by the way, taken from Oswald. No police force does that. It is indefensible that many policemen thought that the murder of Officer Tippet was more important than the murder of Kennedy, and that effectively took them away to look into that case, which they also bungled, by the way. So blame exists everywhere, but from the point of view of organizational skills, it has to be the CIA.
Now, you say it has to be the CIA. Could you maybe give me a kind of like a more clear, like the strongest point in your mind that you would give to someone who's new? The reason I ask this is because through all this case, you can point at anybody else besides Oswald, but one of the theories, whether it's the LBJ theory, whether it's the oilman theory, whether it's the mafia, it's the other one is when you talk about the government, it goes to the CIA. I'm like, that's so weird because That's the one that like we don't really have a lot of whole, it's like lying documents if you do see them. I mean, there's even the Warren Commission or the HSCA investigated the fact that the J. Edgar Hoover considered himself an adversary of the Warren Commission. That's labeled there. So they're already saying the FBI is not giving us what we want. They're a problem. You would think, okay, the FBI was behind it then, but the CIA, that's the one that's the most secretive, and everyone, that's like the, I think out of all the polls, it shows that that one's the highest percentage of Americans believe that it was some type of military industrial CIA plot.
That's exactly right. What we didn't know at the time in the 1960s, and we do now, is that the CIA was capable of using assassination as an extension of what that they do, of their policy. Umpteen attempts, for example, on the life of Fidel Castro in Cuba, some of them backed by the CIA. The whole Bay of Pigs backed by the CIA. And the fact that the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, are both involved right at the center of that, pressurizing the Kennedys to take action against Cuba to sort Castro out once and for all. That it doesn't help that they are so secretive. And I can understand why they have to be secretive. No government goes around saying, yeah, we'll tell you everything we know. It wouldn't work. I actually once met a CIA operative on a cruise. I used to lecture on cruise ships. And just for a polite conversation, I said, oh, and what do you do? He said, oh, I'm CIA. And I couldn't believe it. I just sort of sat there and stared at him. But of course, that was it. That was all you got from the man. He wasn't going to spill any more secrets. He wasn't going to tell me what he actually did for a living. So I didn't pursue it. And that is our problem. It's the secrecy of governments. Even in an open democracy like the United States, you've got that secret element. And I have to say, I think there were probably more intelligent operatives in the CIA than the FBI possessed, and certainly the mafia possessed. The mafia's answer is just whack people, kill them straight away. Boom. Don't ask questions. Leave any clues you like because we're untouchable. We can't be found. We're too powerful. They boasted at one point they were more powerful than the American government, which is nonsense. But the CIA could get away with things because they knew how to cover things up in a way that really nobody else did.
Now, did this belief only get confirmed to you later after the Church Committee and all the other kind of congressional investigations that started exposing? Because each one of them kind of touched lightly upon the JFK assassination. The Church Committee did a good job, but like things learning about the CIA heart attack gun and ways to assassinate Fidel Castro, like you had mentioned, only confirmed the belief when we look at CIA rogue. I know people bring up rogue elements, and then they want you to name those elements. We know a couple names that might fit the kind of plot in a way. But basically, you need a basis or some type of foundation of belief of they've done this in the past, so it would make sense if they did it then, which the CIA has proven with other assassination plots in foreign countries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You've got individual people. I mentioned right at the top the Dulles brothers as organizational, as keeping a watch in the corridors of power via the White House, blah, blah, blah. And you come down to people like James Jesus Angleton, agents at that level, agents below him, who really are extremely dodgy. They use a variety of different names. They are in different places at different times. They've been seen in Dallas. They've been seen in New Orleans. They've been seen in Washington at the same time. And that obviously is physically impossible. This is why the cover-up is actually so good, and why you and I are still having this conversation now after all these years about an event that happened before you were even born. You've got to hand it to whoever was behind the assassination, that the cover-up was extremely well done.
When it comes to the role that Alan Dulles played in the cover up, if we're talking about the CIA and we look at kind of like one of the main figureheads, There was a lot of things that Alan Dulles knew at the time when the Warren Commission was investigating that was not properly disclosed until after the fact. That should have been part of the investigation if they were going to do a true, because I don't believe every member was serving for a purpose of covering up a conspiracy. I think a lot of them realized that there's something else going on here and you just want my name on the piece of paper. And that became a little bit more of the dissent, like Hale Boggs, for instance. And then there were other, probably more nefarious characters. But what do you think Alan Dulles's role and clear evidence that this is a manipulation of an investigation? Obviously, he's fired from the Bay of Pigs. Next thing you know, he's in charge of the Warren Commission investigating the president's death.
Yeah, that's the key link that Alan Dulles is there in the Warren Commission. He is the man to make sure that the right questions are asked of the right people. And we've got to remember that the commissioners themselves weren't always present. They had other roles, other duties, other jobs. So they largely left the work to their team of lawyers. People like Liebeler, who actually they decided which witnesses to call. They decided what questions to ask from what I believe was basically a preconceived idea, maybe even an actual script that they were following to make sure that all roads pointed to Oswald, that we can leave it, that here is a deranged lunatic who, by sheer chance, happened to be in the right place at the right time and was able to shoot the president. You need go no further than that. You need ask no more questions. And we have to remember, too, the hysteria of the time. This is not long after McCarthy. This is Reds under the bed country. This is the time when just the hint of communism was enough to besmirch somebody. I mean, just what was it, 2 years before the Kennedy shooting? Spartacus came out. Fantastic, epic film. But his script writer was Dalton Trumbo, who was a communist. And Kirk Douglas, who made the film, couldn't let that fact be known at first because he wouldn't get any funding for it. So it permeated then American society, the hysteria against the Reds. And this was where Dulles was coming from. He was trained in espionage. His enemy was the Soviet Russians. And everything is basically all about that. So the domestic angle, whether Kennedy was killed by a domestic organization, that is pushed aside and it becomes all a matter of foreign policy.
Now, we talked about eliminating the possibility of a getaway driver within 48 hours. But I want to ask you, when you're examining certain statements or documentation, or even looking at who was immediately assuming things, where do you stand on the media? They misreported a lot of things that can lead to a lot of conspiracies. The famous example I usually use is Eddie Barker at the International Trade Mart talking about, I have 3 reports, 2 that are unconfirmed, 1 that is confirmed. The first one that's unconfirmed is JFK is killed. At died at Parkland Hospital. 2 is that Governor Connolly is in surgery, which he said is unconfirmed. And the third, which he said is confirmed, is that a Secret Service agent was killed in Dealey Plaza. So the first 2, he was actually probably right. And then the last one's kind of like the more iffy one. But there's a lot of misreporting. But even if you look at like video footage, when they ask Oswald, what he was being there for. And he was like, they're getting me because I lived in the Soviet Union. I mean, he made a mixture of statements, mostly because he's being charged for killing the president when he was only there for, I guess, killing a cop. But the public assumed. The public was listening to media. The public was assuming things that really, I start wondering, was it just easier for the Warren Commission to be like, fuck it, the government or the people believe it was Oswald. Let's just say it was Oswald.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. I think the media carry a lot of responsibility. And in a way, it's understandable. The sheer shock of what happened means that the press reporters who were there in Dallas were trying to take it all in. They were trying to react. They were trying to find relevant people who might have seen something. And they were trying to put that in front of the microphones, in front of the cameras, into newsprint, whatever their angle was, and they had to do it at lightning speed. And we all know that in that situation, mistakes are made, and that incorrect information, misinformation fake news, as we'd say today, comes out straight away, and it muddied the waters, and it has always muddied the waters. I mean, there were pressmen in the motorcade, but there were so many cars back that they couldn't see what happened, and they are reacting blindly to events. So they grab people on street corners, quite literally, saying, "What did you see? Did you hear anything? Yeah, I heard firecrackers, whatever." And it's only from one man, as far as I know, a guy called Brennan, that we have Oswald put in the frame at all. He said he saw Oswald in the famous sniper's nest in the window of the School Book Depository. But he was 30 feet down from Oswald. He could only have seen him from the waist up. And yet he was able to say he was 5'10". What? It just doesn't make any sense. But that is the narrative the GPG went for. They were looking for somebody possibly carrying a rifle, who was 5'10", a white man with dark hair, and oh, look, there he is. And Tippet, presumably, tried to arrest Oswald. I can't think of any other reason why that incident, why that meeting would have taken place. And it was based on false information.
I want to ask you about the seeing a person in the sniper's window or sniper's nest. Howard Brennan made a lot of statements, but then when the Warren Commission had him in there, they were like, "You can maybe just go home and come back tomorrow or something and see if we can get a better statement from you," because he couldn't identify where he was at the time. He changed it so many times, the Warren Commission had to make it fit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He was the consensus is that he was standing on the corner of Elm and Houston, facing the depository, looking up. But he admitted that his eyesight wasn't very good. He admitted he wasn't wearing his glasses. As you say, his position changes as he talks to the press as time goes on, and yet he is one of the most reliable witnesses that the Warren Commission had, according to Gerald Ford, who, of course, long before he became president, was on that commission too.
I want to ask
Doesn't make sense.
yeah, none of it makes sense in the case, to be honest with you. But when it comes to the Warren Commission, why do you think they would print so much of this stuff in their volumes? I know Alan Dulles quoted saying like nobody will read it anyway, but the Warren report or the official narrative does not reflect throughout their volumes. I would know. I'm documenting every witness in the Warren Commission volumes right now. I'm making a video clip for it for my generation. And you know how many comments I get on YouTube like, "What the hell does this have to do with the assassination?" I'm like, you tell me. It's from the Warren Commission's own volumes.
Well, this is right. You have to remember that he's talking about 26 volumes here. If you put them on the floor, it's the height of a man. And at first, of course, there was no index. Not until Sylvia Meager actually went through it, and bless her, she did a terrific job in actually putting an index so you can find individuals and sort out the massive verbiage that it contains. And yeah, I think that's right. Nobody's going to read it. In that original format, it was almost unreadable. It's only now that it's been broken down and analysed, we can see just how mendacious the whole thing is. Nowhere more so, of course, than in the ludicrous magic bullet theory. I mean, that is pure science fiction. And what I find appalling is that there have been a number of programs, documentaries on television, both in the States and the UK, where that false physics has been continued virtually up to the present day. The Zapruder film clearly showing the president's head jerked backwards because it's a shot from the front, from the grassy knoll. That has been transposed by some filmmakers into saying, "Oh no, that's just an involuntary reflex. The bullet came from behind," which is what the Warren Commission said happened.
Yeah, when you really look at kind of the not doubt, but the mislooking or not wanting to look at the evidence that there was a conspiracy because either the stigma that's attached to it. I mean, how did you at the time be able to uncover information or even be able to talk about it? And I mean, get to the point now where you have a book on the assassination. It's obviously not an easy topic to talk about over in the United States. I don't know if it's easier in the UK to address it, or maybe you guys just talk about conspiracies different, but really trying to get someone to examine the facts or just examine the evidence, even the stuff that's printed in their own volumes, you would think would be
Yeah,
easier.
the problem, of course, is the passage of time. The fact that now all we have to rely on is effectively the written word and film footage. Now, some of that film footage itself is degraded, it's deteriorating. You really can't see what's going on. One of the photographs I use in my book is one taken of the motorcade by a guy called Altjens. And he's got a photograph behind the president's car. This is after the headshot. Car is moving away from us towards the overpass towards Stemmons Freeway. And there is a car in front of him. And there is an image behind the car which has to be a motorcycle outrider. There's nothing else it can possibly be, but it doesn't look like a motorcycle. It doesn't look like a human being. It is just a shapeless thing. And that's the problem with historical evidence. Even with film footage, you cannot actually rely on what it shows. And you certainly can't rely on any testimony that's written down, whether it's Warren Commission, whether it's a Dallas newspaper. It doesn't really matter because it's all interpreted by somebody else. It comes through a third party. I would have thought if you said to me, we have this moving image of a man being killed, therefore we know what went on. I'd say, yes, of course, you're bound to, but we don't, do we? Whether the Zapruder film was doctored, whether that was altered by somebody just to cause confusion, I don't know. It seems at least a possibility, though.
But why would the Life magazine buy the Zapruder film and then store it for so long? You would think that that'd be the most damaging historical, like, oh my God, we got the scoop. And then next thing you know, they store it and they don't release it for all those years. I'm like, that just doesn't seem right of what maybe a different perception of media, but it seemed like something else was going on.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me either. There's also the story that the film was looked at by a junior technician who didn't really know what he was doing. He was new to the job, and he himself may have inadvertently spliced it. That it wasn't an intentional cover-up, that it was just a mistake, a cock-up again, which happens often, I think, in situations like that. But I can't think of a logical reason why Time magazine, having paid a fortune for it in the first place, would not actually use it. Perhaps they're hoping that it'll all die down, that once the furore has passed, people would discuss things more rationally, more calmly. I just don't know. But the mainstream media in America, and I can't speak actually for now, you probably know more about it than I do, but for years they clung to Oswald did it theory. They weren't prepared to accept any kind of conspiracy at all. And isn't that surely because if you do think of a conspiracy, then what does that say about American society? What does that say about any society where the system takes out the head man? It's not a lone nut. It is the system, whether it's CIA, whether it's FBI, whether it's the mafia. It is part of the society that has done that. It is a coup. Just as surely as, say, the assassination of Julius Caesar was a coup. And that's a terrifying prospect, I think. And I think that's why mainstream media have clung to Oswald for so long.
When you're not able to, or when you're pushing blame or saying it's the CIA or saying it's some part of the military you're trying to expose the cover up, what you have to then look at when you're evaluating evidence, in my opinion, is you have to start looking at witness statements. Now, I know a lot of people quickly throw those out and say you can't trust them, they're not reliability. Yes, for one or two. But if you have 100 something people saying there was a shot coming from the knoll or they heard sounds coming from the knoll, that would be something worth investigating at the least. And there is a small little summary that it ends with no conclusive evidence was found. I was like, did you bother even really searching? You just talked about a couple of people. But I want to ask your opinion on, based on the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, you mentioned Ulchins, but one thing that is important about his photograph is not just for historical value, but if you look in the backwards, Zapruder standing on that little pergola thing, right behind him is Marilyn Zitzmore, the secretary of Zapruder, holding him still. She was never interviewed by the Warren Commission. She was never interviewed by the HSCA, and she believed it was Oswald. But then you heard it was her oral history interview, and she goes, to be honest, I've seen so much now, I don't know anymore. To say that it's just Oswald that acted alone and did all that, I would say that sounds the least likely to believe. And I go, that's all it is. You looked at all the years of slow trickle of information that just became, oh, this was wrong, or this was wrong, or this was wrong. And then you compile all that into like what? Showing people that now all in one go. They're like, wait, what happened? It's like, oh, it's so crazy to believe now because these all came out in like 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And everyone started having doubts about the whole
Yeah.
lone nut narrative.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The passage of time does cause an enormous problem. I read an essay fairly recently about American presidents, and this was written by a high-ranking British politician who I think had served as ambassador to America. So he knew the States system, he knew the British system, and he said, just a throwaway line, on balance of probabilities, I think probably the Warren Commission was right. Now, this was written 2 years ago. And I find that appalling that this man with vast amounts of political experience can actually still be saying that now, after all the information that everybody has uncovered, that you've mentioned, that I've mentioned. People like that will not change their mind. I find it quite bizarre.
Yeah, I don't get the whole defending the Warren Commission. I understand if people want to say it's still Oswald. I understand that because I think that's still kind of like I'm still skeptical on what who's actually taking a shot. I believe there was more than one shooter, but when we look at the Warren Commission, though, I have and I am reading through it right now. You start becoming convinced if you're looking at their documentation that maybe the Warren Commission could have had some things that were right, because there is a lot of about like Jack Ruby. I've learned a lot more about his personality and his thing, but it just seems like there's a mixed bag, and the one that they chose was the one that sided with their version instead of saying Ruby was either this person or he was this person depending on who you met. But everyone agrees, even with Ruby, the whole spur of insanity nonsense and all this. They're like, Ruby never talked about politics, or he talked about politics. I'm like, guys, like, mostly you can take a personality test online. It's 10 questions and it's not a good one, but they'll tell you who you are. You know, not maybe this, maybe that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, what's happened now is that we have two armed camps, don't we? We have the conservatives with a small c, people who stick to Oswald. The Warren Commission got it right. Yeah, he was a lone nut. He was a commie. End of story. And then you've got the conspiracy theorists. And this has been whipped up out of all proportion by social media, that anybody can jump onto a bandwagon and point fingers in all directions, and it becomes sillier and sillier and sillier. I was reading the British press this morning about the election that you guys have just had, in which there have been computer glitches in some states with counting votes. Computer glitches happen all the time. Computers are notoriously unreliable, but already conspiracy theorists are saying, aha, there we are. That's not a glitch. That's been done. It's been done by Trump. It's been done by Harris. Because humans love that. They love the idea of something murky going on under the surface. They're not prepared to accept that sometimes some things happen. So the more of this we get, the more social media involvement we have, the more difficult it will be ever to provide answers to this kind of thing.
What I appreciate about your book and appreciate about your perspective is the fact that you kind of look at both sides, but you do kind of tackle a more evidence-based approach. Now, that is not always the most interesting. If you go on social media now, the most interesting things are Kennedy had an affair, Kennedy's brain was altered, or Kennedy's autopsy was this. And I'm like, look, we can try and go into those claims, but there's not a verified, like, there's a lot of people that sit on the fence on a lot of these things. It's kind of like the Zapruder film alteration. People believe it's altered. People believe it doesn't. In my opinion, it's good historically to look at it, but we're basing a lot off of a silent film. Like the number of shots based on the reactions that we're watching the people make. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. So
Yeah, you're right.
you kind of have to look at what is things that are very weird that should not have happened if it was a lone nut assassin. One is the fact that the president's brain has been missing since 1966. Nobody knows where it is. It just vanished out of the archives. That's a little strange. I would say someone would at least put it in a box somewhere and, have a receipt for it or anything. But there's a lot about the evidence, I would say, when you're trying to tackle the approach. You mentioned the people that still believe the Warren Commission was 100% right. Can I get a pro and a negative on the Warren Commission? Your best example of why they had some things right and then why there was a lot of things that were mistakes. Just one example's fine.
Okay. Well, one example, one negative example has got to be the magic bullet because they were concerned with the three shots that some witnesses said they heard. Then they had to make those three bullets fit, and they had to make it fit the Mancacano rifle that Oswald allegedly carried, although he was never seen with it. And therefore, the idea of a bullet changing flight in midair and causing 7 wounds, that is total and utter nonsense and should never have been put forward and should never have been accepted. In the case of something that is positive, I think really you had to applaud them because of the speed at which they moved. That they weren't given very long to put this piece together. Lyndon Johnson was so concerned to wrap it up that he pressured Warren himself, who in turn presumably pressured the others into coming out with answers. So the fact that they found the witnesses they did and were able to get that information from them, I think that is a positive good. I could imagine that if something happened today, certainly in the UK, that kind of inquiry would take years. It really wouldn't start for 12 months after the event. And by the time they actually come out with their findings, it would be 2.5 or 3 years in the future, which obviously is hopeless. And the Warren Commission didn't do that. They acted with speed. I wish I could say they also acted with efficiency, but I'm afraid they didn't.
I want to address kind of both those points. Now, I'm sure it's multifactorial here, but I really try and say like I don't believe it's one grandiose conspiracy. I just believe it's a couple people at the top, and you don't need anybody else. Like if you need to know, then you need to know. If you don't need to know, then you don't have to know. But when we talk about kind of one of the negative things here, your point that you addressed, and even with one of the positives, I mean, the speed at which they got it out. Well, we found out through documentation that they were talking to media like NBC, telling them to make a coordinated hit piece on Jim Garrison for his and to have a special release as soon as the Warren report came out to boost their efforts and boost faith. Now, that can be, we do need to have faith in our institutions. We do need to have faith in government, and we do put our trust in them to be able to come to the conclusion. But when you mention the magic bullet, a bullet that can somehow, one bullet that can transverse two people, make 8 different wounds or however many wounds and do whatever, and come out like almost, with a little bit of damage to it, but basically intact. You have to examine the original phone call with Hoover was that there were 3 shots fired. He was talking to LBJ on the phone. Sorry, I'm going to do my old timey telephone voice. But he goes, there were 3 shots fired. And Johnson says, were any of them fired at me? He goes, no, sir, all aimed at the president's car and all of them hit. Well, that's not true because we see the one that straight off hit the curb, bounced up, and it hit James Tague in the cheek. So that 3 shots, all aimed at Kennedy, bumps down to 2 in the creation of the magic bullet. Now, what's an investigation done by? You know, you've done true crime books. It's done by people. People make mistakes. They didn't properly investigate in the first place. They were working with evidence. Examine Arlen Specter. I got 3 shells. I need you to make it fit.
Yeah,
Arlen Specter's doing
absolutely.
his job.
He is. And then you've got people like Nicholas Katzenbach, the Attorney General, stepping in to say, we've got to make sure everybody believes Oswald is guilty. Now, this is the senior law enforcement officer in that sense in the country, and he's biased as hell. He's saying, pin it on Oswald. LBJ more or less said the same thing. The Dallas Police Department said the same thing. And so it crowds in on the Warren Commission to make sure that that is proven in inverted commas. And they gave it their best shot, but it wasn't good enough.
It's what I've noticed now, and I get a little bit of heat from it when I'm sure if you kind of tackle it more in an evidence-based approach, you might get some heat from it too. And I want to ask about if you have received kind of some bad comments or anything like that about just people that there are people that want to assume psychological factors when it comes to certain members, like, oh, you can just tell he's evil, or LBJ, I knew from day one he was an evil man. I'm like, well, that's not evidence. You can't psychologically break somebody down without ever knowing them, meeting them, or anything like that. Just seeing them on a television or seeing that. I mean, we can base a lot from documentation, but really we just base on the fact that there were certain things that weren't, investigated. And in their own documentation, they said there's not a need to do that. You're like, well, that's just, you would basically do that. But I want to ask about kind of negative comments for you because I've noticed more now. I don't know if it's just through interviews I've been watching and stuff like that, but people that are on the conspiracy side and people that are on the lone nut side, they stop saying this is 100% fact, and they start saying I've heard in my belief, I've heard in this, and I've heard that. I've even stopped somebody on my show saying Oswald did it for the attention. That's why he was screaming police brutality in the theater. And I go, well, when he was arrested and put in the squad car and going back to DPD headquarters, he was screaming that. So what press is he hyping it up for? And you start realizing people are now connecting dots like everyone tries to do when they're solving true crime. They start connecting
Yeah,
things.
yes,
And it's like,
absolutely.
you can't do that when we don't have the evidence for it. You're making an assumption that since I have $5 in my pocket, I'm hungry, and Subway's doing a $5 footlong, that I'm going to go to Subway and get lunch. I could just stay home and choose not to eat.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. We've all become armchair detectives, haven't we? We watch a lot of television. We watch true crime documentaries. We watch cop shows, and we buy into it. We believe it, and the crime is solved in 45 minutes to allow for the adverts. So, for example, you've got uh, Special Victims Unit with the FBI driving around in their black 4x4s, and it's all good, gutsy stuff, and they solve it every time, working in conjunction with the local police. But notice the local police never solve it. It's the guys themselves because they're the experts, they know what they're doing, but they don't give us the information. So it's all about instinct, it's all about intuition, it's all about looking a man or a woman in the eyes and saying, yes, you are guilty, or you are a liar, or you're covering something else up. And you're absolutely right, without evidence. And I keep coming back to the point that the longer ago a crime takes place, the less evidence we have. I've written 4 books on Jack the Ripper, one of the most famous unknown killers in the world. And it is infuriating that there was once information on Jack that we don't have any more. Some people literally stole it. They took it away from the Scotland Yard archives just so they had something to do with the case. Other people lost it, they mislaid it, they burnt it, who knows? But it's gone. And now we're never going to know because we don't have the information. It's tragic.
I'm going to have you back on to talk about Jack the Ripper. That's a large interest for me, but I've never found anybody be able to talk about it that much.
Oh,
Um,
well, I'd love to. Come back to me and we'll do this again.
yeah, we're not going to mix it with JFK. That'd be too much.
Don't
Um,
confuse the issue. No, no, no.
I want to add.
If I can just say on that score, I've never been to Dallas. I would love to go and walk Dealey Plaza, but I do know Whitechapel like the back of my hand, where the
Great.
Ripper Cunnings took place. So
All
yeah,
right, I'll set.
I'm your man.
I'll definitely set something up. We'll schedule something for that. But to the topic of JFK here, I want to ask about some kind of negative interactions you've had. Obviously, with both sides of the community, like I mentioned, you can come across people that have their own theory or their own thing and their own conclusion. I get it all the time in comments from on YouTube or something. Like I just did a comment about Godfrey McHugh, and someone's like, "Oh yeah, that was the general who was usually in the middle when Kennedy went through his motorcades, but this time he was moved all the way to the back, which people think is suspicious." But some guy commented that he had an affair with Jackie. He dated Jackie, but not during when she was married to JFK. She dated him before when her last name was Bouvier or something like that before she got married. So that's again, people have their own theories, and you comment like, "Here's the factual thing." They give you, "No, it's not. This is it," and a lot of that can stem from researchers. So I'm curious, from your perspective, writing a book and getting comments, whether it's reviews or something like that.
Well, what is a fact is that the motorcade formation was different in Dallas from anything that they'd done before. When the president appeared elsewhere, he was much more surrounded by police, by outriders, and by support cars. Whereas coming from Love Field, he is very much exposed. And then you've got the vexed question of the bubble top. Who ordered that to be taken off? Some accounts say Kennedy did because he wanted to be seen by the people, blah, blah, blah. Other accounts say no, it was the security forces. The Secret Service was responsible. I've even heard that the Dallas police said it would be a good idea. So where do you go with that? I just don't know how to get the answer to those questions. But certainly the formation itself was not the same as it had been. There were no attempts for real in Chicago, although one was hinted at. But obviously, there was a clear attempt and a successful one in Dallas. Is that coincidence? I don't know.
I would say if you're going to choose one of those or choose any subject in your book, where did you feel you found the most resistance from someone?
Resistance.
Yeah, like as just a reader, someone that might have had their own opinion on how the assassination worked out, but you came to a different conclusion.
Well, I think probably we've got the conservative angle, sticking to Oswald, sticking to the Warren Commission. People like Gerald Posner today, who've written some extraordinarily detailed and well-researched books. They continue to bang that drum. And I think they're wrong. But I want to stress that I am not a conspiracy theorist. I think there was more than one shooter involved in Dealey Plaza. Now, if that makes me a conspiracy theorist, then so be it. But I'm not one of these nuts who's going to go out on a limb and talk about Jack Ruby being experimented on and given drugs and so on. As far as I know, the man died from cancer, simply as that. But once you go down that road, then it does become impossible. And you yourself, of course, become a laughingstock.
Yeah, it makes it difficult because you just want to talk about the case, and you find that conversation, like much like how we're having now, even if it's between the lone nut and the conspiracy side, a lot of people tend to agree on certain aspects, but they just disagree on one thing. It's like so hard when everyone's got their own independent theories. But how did you manage to get documentation and get information as the years progressed? Which researcher did you bother looking at? Obviously, David Lifton passed away, but a lot of people recommend his work, and a lot of his stuff is very, I wouldn't say it is controversial, but it's a lot of it I'm looking at, I'm like, I don't know. That just sounds so strange. And maybe he saw something we didn't see, but they've done great work. Harold Weisberg is a god to me, even though every researcher hates him.
Weisberg he's a tremendous guy, bearing in mind that the hardships he had to try and get his book published at all. And self-publishing now is straightforward, but it wasn't in his day, and he really had to work like hell to get out there in any shape or form. The result is not very polished. It's a very physically badly written book with appalling pictures, which does no favors at all to his point of view. Lifton,
Like
I
a
would love
Playboy
Lifton.
magazine, awful pictures and horrible detail.
That's right. I would love Lifton to be right because it's such an ingenious theory that somebody tampered with the president's head on board Air Force One, blah blah blah. But I don't think it makes sense. It's a massive, massive book. It runs to I don't know 600 pages plus, but he doesn't quite make the case. It's just a little bit too far fetched for me. As is the theory that the shot was an accidental one by one of Kennedy's bodyguards
Yeah, George Hickey.
using an AR-15 rifle. Again, it's a shot from behind, which doesn't gel with what I've seen from the Zapruder film and from what various eyewitnesses talked about in terms of the grassy knoll. I must just say this, by the way. I said earlier I was a teacher for 38 years, and I taught this to a class of 13-year-olds, that the whole shooting. We reenacted it. I got people out there at the front of the class sitting in the Lincoln, in the positions and so on. And I asked them at the end who they thought did it. And one girl thought it was probably Jackie Kennedy because she was so annoyed that Jack was having an affair with Marilyn Monroe that she got somebody to shoot him. I pointed out that was a bit unlikely because she was kind of close to the whole bullet traveling thing. But my favorite one, another girl said that it was a mysterious gunman called Grassy Knoll. I thought that was really very, very good. So maybe, as I say in the book, I hadn't taught that terribly well. I don't know.
Can I want to get your kind of opinion on something that you always found interesting in the case, or something that you looked into the case that you just could not include in your book. Obviously, there's a lot of unanswered questions in the case for a lot of us, and we all want answers of who did it, who exactly did it. But I want to get your thoughts on one area that you just bothered not to put in the book because maybe you don't know, but it's always been something in your mind. We're like, that's very weird and interesting. What you mentioned about Jack Ruby and the cancer thing, that is of interest to me. I've done episodes on MK Ultra and stuff like that. I have documentation to prove where it was being conducted at, but the Ruby thing was always something where I was like, we don't really have the documentation we need, but it's definitely one of those that sits in my head. I'm like, I mean, that would explain like his drawings in his jail cell. He did it all freehand, and they're all perfect diamonds. And that even the jailer in his oral history interview is like, yeah, you gave it to my kids. I'm like, you gave that to your children.
Yeah, there you go. That's absolutely right. And the fact that Earl Warren had the chance to move Ruby to Washington, where he'd been relatively safe, and didn't, I find that very suspicious. And the area which I mention in the book, but I played down because I really don't know what to do with it, is the whole New Orleans connection. It's the whole Jim Garrison thing. It's the whole Clay Shaw. I don't know how that fits. I'm sure there is a connection, but I'm not clear what it is. And in the end, of course, it got nowhere because the case failed. And in the end, Garrison basically gave up, which I think is a shame, but I can understand why he did.
I don't think we've ever had a conspiracy person have that much attorney power or just government court power or anything. To me, to be able to bring people to court over certain allegations or certain things, whether those claims are verified or not. I mean, it's much like Penn Jones and his Midlothian Mirror. When did we ever have a newspaper that was able to publish things? The Texas Observer is a great example because Ronnie Duggar was like the first one who was writing articles about case not closed. And all, I was like, good for him for doing that. But we never had anybody with that type of power before, especially with media or government power to be able to do anything, which makes more reason why they were targeted as such.
Yeah, exactly right. And what fascinated me too is the furore over the Oliver Stone film JFK, which I've seen 3 or 4 times now, and it's a bewildering film in that he puts far too much into it. he puts just about every theory there is crammed in. Even before the credits, you've got things happening which are involved with conspiracy. But it was completely slammed by the conservative elements in the States, wasn't it? People hated it. They accused Stone of all kinds of things. Whereas in the UK, it was accepted, yeah, that's probably right, you know? Whereas earlier movies that haven't covered the thing quite in the same way, but more or less didn't turn a hair. It's almost as if Stone had got near to the truth somehow. Something within the film was actually true, which hadn't been exposed before. And because of the way the world has gone, something visual, like the Zapruder film, like a movie JFK, has more impact than the written word. So it doesn't matter how many books people like me write, it's what you see on the screen that counts. And I find that a quite fascinating judgment, really, on the way society has developed.
I don't know, man. I'm happy you wrote a book. I'm happy you're out there. Thank God, man. I do want to ask about why do you think it's the conservative element that seems to lean more towards the lone nut narrative? I've noticed that too, where I've kind of wondered why they would not branch off into something else. I don't know if it's because of that old school mentality of protecting the government or being a patriotic duty type deal, but usually it's the kind of the leftists I'm noticing that are more conspiracy oriented, which in today's time, the left now is not anyway in any sort conspiracy minded. Now it would be the Republican Party, at least over here in the States. So I always thought that was weird. I was coming across more of the conservative people that were, oh, it was Oswald. There's no, I was like, really? It was like, you modern day conservatives are a little bit more conspiracy than your older selves.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I don't know. It's a very difficult thing, and I'm sure it does have to do with patriotism to an extent. I mean, I think America is a much more patriotic country than the UK. The UK used to be, but it's not anymore. We've changed our position on all that, but I don't think the States has. If you take the Marines, Semper Fi, and all that, you know, in the States, as far as I understand it, the Marines are gods. In Britain, they are just one of many regiments, and although we're proud of them, we don't put them quite on the same pedestal. Now, that's the conservative with the small c angle, I think, from which all that is coming. If we change our minds on that, if we accept that there was a conspiracy, if we're saying that some institution, be it the CIA, FBI, whoever, is behind the murder of the president, then we are somehow being unfaithful to our country, and that is not acceptable.
I'm going to ask you this, and this is going to be kind of one of the last questions here. But when it comes to witness statements, do you believe any witness statements were altered, either left out or something of that sort?
Yes, there are a lot of examples of that, particularly, funnily enough, with the shooting of Tippet. Nobody actually saw the shooting of J.D. Tippet, as I understand it. They heard the shots, they were nearby, they saw the aftermath. They saw one man running away. They saw another man walking away. They saw two men in a car nearby. So we have immediately a kind of scrambled egg version, a conflicted version of what actually happened in the officer's killing. But some of those were clearly hysterical. I'm thinking of Mrs. Markham. She had to lie down after she gave her first statement to the Warren Commission. She was in a total state of hysteria. She had to be medicated, and yet they relied on what she said. Now, I don't see how you can do that. If the woman is hysterical, what did she see? According to her, she sat and held Tippet's hand while he's dying for 20 minutes, which is strange because he was killed instantly with a bullet to the head. Other witnesses who were there didn't see anybody sitting next to Tippet's body. So something is very amiss there. And the Warren Commission failed to get to the truth of all that.
Do you think Oswald killed Tippet?
No, I don't. I think Um, it's tricky, this one, and I avoided trying to say it because I really don't know the answer and I don't have the evidence. But I think Tippett was, sorry, Oswald was a patsy. He was involved. He was in the depository, and he was a kind of lookout for the actual shooter. There may have been a shooter in the depository. There may have been one in the Daltex building, which is next door. It actually provided a better shooting trajectory than the book depository did. There was certainly somebody on the grassy knoll. So we have at least a two-pronged attack, possibly three. Oswald's role was to let somebody in to the depository and get them out again. Thereafter, he was told to meet up at the Texas Theater, where they were showing the Van Heflin war film, because whoever he's working for, be it CIA, be it FBI, he's being handled. He's got somebody above him who was going to meet him for a debrief in that picture house. That's why he was there. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running from the police. He was going there. I don't think he had any idea that Tippett had been shot at all. It's streets away from the cinema itself. So again, a patsy.
I always thought it was interesting that Tippett stopped the suspect through the right front vent window. Um, if you know, there's the actual window and there's a little triangle window or whatever shape that's a little bit in front of the front window. What cop stops somebody through that thing if you're either not hesitant of who you're stopping, or even past police officers and detectives have talked about that's a strange, like he had to be crooked or something corrupt for that one. But it was always, that was always an interesting one for me. And then also, where are your stances on the HSCA? I've had Blakey on the show. I think he did as best as he possibly could. I mean, you're kind of like, hey, you're head of RICO, an organized crime attack, right? And he's like, yeah. And they're like, do you mind looking into the Kennedy assassination? Of course, he's going to unturn every rock that happens to do with the mafia. That's what his whole like basis was. But when it came to them not being honest with him, when I spoke with him, he did admit that he thinks that the CIA withheld a lot of information that they should have. And I don't think he was a willing accomplice into the whole conspiracy. I think he was just doing his job as a government employee, and he thought that they would give him honest transparency. But there are some off the book meetings that I addressed with him, and he doesn't really remember. But there is some issues where it came to something might have been like, hey, you know, we can't have this out there to the public, and he accepted that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. In the case of the mafia, who do you believe? What do you believe? I mean, these guys, by definition, are criminals. They live through lies. You could, of course, say the same thing of the CIA. So honesty is at a bit of a premium, and they all had form, as we say in the UK. They had previous. We know that the Kennedys wanted to wipe out the CIA. They also wanted to wipe out organized crime. So that there is a motive there, isn't there, for both those organizations to do something about it.
But what about your thoughts on the HSCA, just when it came to how they investigated? They obviously proved conspiracy at the end, or there's a high likely chance of conspiracy. I think it was like 95% or something like that. But what are your thoughts on just their investigation? Do you think it was another show like the Warren Commission, or do you think that they were able to expose like a limited hangout?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that's happened. But words are cheap, aren't they? And I'd be a lot happier if they could have taken it a stage further. Yes, there was a conspiracy, but let's now find out who is behind it. Let's not just shrug and say, "Hey, what are you going to do?" That was back in 1963. Let's all move on. It was a cold-blooded murder. And it was not properly investigated then, and it still isn't being properly investigated now.
As a final conclusion here, can you maybe give a kind of wrap or summary just for people out there of the whole Kennedy assassination through your perspective when it came to just there was a conspiracy? Kind of like a summary, like how your book is. where you're really just trying to tell people, look, there was this that didn't happen, this that didn't happen, but this is why we look into it.
Sure. Well, I think probably the president had annoyed a lot of people. There were a lot of institutions, organizations, individuals who he had crossed, and they wanted revenge. So there's plenty of motive, there's plenty of reason to get him. Dallas was a perfect place because it was, as he himself said, not country. Texas was known for its violence, it was known for its gun culture. Nobody liked Kennedy there. He was seen as too much of a Martha's Vineyard guy. He's an Ivy League man. He's a Yankee. He's an Irishman. You name it. He doesn't fit the South. This is where LBJ came in. This is why Johnson was his vice president, because he was going to help him to do that. That's the theory. So one of those organizations, not an individual like Oswald, wanted him dead. And Dealey Plaza is the obvious place to do it. How even an organization like the CIA could have organized it so perfectly, I don't know. One of those strange things is how Oswald was able to get that job in the Texas School Book Depository, overlooking the very route the motorcade would take. And ask yourself, why did the motorcade go that way? It should have gone straight across Dealey Plaza towards the Stemmons Freeway, instead of which it turned a sharp right onto Houston and then a sharp left onto Elm, slowing down each time. It was absolutely perfect for a shooting to take place. So somebody orchestrated that, somebody organized it. And I've racked my brains looking through the evidence, trying to find who decided that the motorcade would change its route. And you don't get a clear answer. Everybody passes the buck to everybody else. But somebody organized it, and then the almost military style shooting kicks in. You've got the man on the grassy knoll who fires the first shot that hits Kennedy in the throat. We see it happening on the Zapruder film. You've got one, possibly two men behind who fire from behind, possibly one from the School Book Depository, possibly one from the Daltex building, which account for the wounds in his back and the back of his head. The final shot is the one from the grassy knoll that blows the back of his head out, which is clear in all sorts of accounts, which is clear in the Zapruder film. Then we start to ask, who did it? And that's what we're still talking about now, X number of years after the event. And I don't have an answer. I wish I did. But if I did, there'd be a million people who would say, you're wrong. That's rubbish. So maybe we should leave it as a huge question mark, should we?
It's kind of like the creation of the universe. Was it the Big Bang?
Yeah.
We're never going to know. Just keep talking about it till everybody's dead. Mr. Trow, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find your book and any other links you'd like to promote?
Yes, sure. They can do it, I think, via my publisher. That's Pen and Sword. And the address is www.penandsword.com.
And I'll make sure I link all those links in the description. We'll have to plan a chat about Jack the Ripper, but we'll save that for another episode, obviously. And I do appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, and I appreciate everybody out there listening to this episode, and stay tuned for our next